Hello and welcome to Hey, Ask Me Stuff, the show where you get to, hey, ask me stuff. It really is that simple. I am your host today, Ken Coughlin, and I am a Christian apologist here with Trinity Lutheran Church in Joppa, Maryland. And over there, behind the glass, is our illustrious producer, and his name is...
B.A. Thomas. Nice to meet you again.
It could be the first time.
It could.
You don't know. This could be something. We could have somebody watching for the first time ever here today. So, hey, thanks for joining us. If you didn't join us last week and I look a little bit off, that's because, yes, I am recovering from Bell's palsy. I'm 3 weeks in now. It was 3 weeks ago today that I had to go to the emergency room.
You're making pretty fine recovery.
Yes, and so it's not as fast as some people, but still very fast and a blessing. So yeah, I did lose complete control of the right side of my face. Couldn't control any of the muscles there, as hopefully you can tell, especially if you watched last week's episode. I'm getting a lot of that back. I'm very pleased. I'm able to eat more easily now. I can talk more clearly now. Not all the way back yet. My right eye, you'll notice, still doesn't really blink and move the same along with my left eye. So that may look a little funky, but who knows? Maybe next week everything will be fine. Except, speaking of next week, we're not having a show next week.
Oh, yeah.
The reason we're not having a show next week is because a very great man who's been a very large influence in my life, he's the head of school here by the name of Randy Gast, Randall C. Gast for the official look, is actually retiring from his position here as head of school. And we're having a big chapel service at 2 o'clock next Wednesday afternoon, followed by a reception in his honor and all of that. So I'm going to be at that and not on the show. So we will not have a show here next week, but we will be back in 2 weeks. So let me tell you all a little bit of something about the show. If this is your first time watching, so you know what it's about and how you can participate in it. Like I said before, the name of the show is Hey, Ask Me Stuff. And the reason for that is this show is entirely viewer driven. At least that's the vision for it. And that is that we want you, our viewers, to pick the topics that we are talking about every single week. All right. In a perfect world, we would have really virtually very little to do with it other than just picking out amongst all the different options which ones we're actually going to do. But we want to know what questions you have about Jesus, about the Bible, about God, about ancient Israel, about Christianity today and Christianity versus culture. Anything that's on your mind, we want to know. And you can submit your questions to us, and we will consider and pick from those what the topic will be for each week's show. So the natural question is, how do you get your question to us? Well, glad you asked. There's a couple ways. Number one, and the best way to do it is you go to our website, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. That is trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. There's a form on that page that you can fill out, and that you can fill out to submit your question to us. We will then get that question. And that can be anything, broad scope of topics, whatever is on your mind. Put it in that form, send it to us, and we will look at that as a potential topic for one of our programs. Another way you can get your thoughts to us is through Reddit. Every Monday, typically, although we were bad, it was Tuesday this week, we will put a prompt up, some kind of broad general prompt up on Reddit. Ideally, if we do have like a topic that is submitted to us from one of our viewers, then we will take that general topic and we will use that to formulate the prompt. Other times, like this week, we can actually use current events to help formulate that prompt if we don't have a particular topic that someone has asked for. And then you can respond to that prompt with your thoughts, and that's another way of possibly getting your thoughts here on the air. Where you find us on Reddit, we do submit it in a few different Reddits that have to do with Christianity, but the one that I can guarantee you it will be on is Talk About God. The subreddit Talk About God, we run it. So we can decide what goes in that. And so every week, at a minimum, if you find the subreddit Talk About God, it will be put there. You can share your thoughts with us there. The other thing we'd like to ask you to do before we get going here is if you do like our video, please go ahead and give us a thumbs up there on the like. Subscribe to the YouTube channel so you don't miss out any of our great content. And click that little notification bell, and that will let you know when we post new things, including the 513 show, which I've been pushing, which is going to premiere 1 week from tomorrow. I can officially announce that the 513 show will be premiering on Thursday, September 29th. What time did we decide, BA? Do you remember? Was it 7 o'clock at night? Is that what we
think
decided?
it's 7 o'clock at night. Yeah, good call. Good remembrance.
So, 7 o'clock tonight, not tomorrow, but a week from tomorrow, will be that music and musician themed show, the 513 show. Make sure you tune in for that. So with that being said, I will tell you that it really can only be described as a starting point because the conversation kind of went along from there. But if, I'm sure most of you have heard is that Queen Elizabeth II did pass away this past week. A very, one of the most well-known and well-loved, I think, rulers in the world today. And that got us here in the studio talking a little bit about the intersection of our faith and government service. And BA, why don't you tell them what we came up with?
We wanted to talk about the separation between church and state. Where does it start? Where does it stop? Should you keep your cross at home, or should you bring it with you when you go to the office to literally make law, literally make decisions on the welfare, well-being, and livelihood of everyone in your jurisdiction, whether it's, your county or an entire nation?
Yeah, and I actually got the title for the show. I titled this episode, Should Government Leaders, quote, leave their religion at home? And that is from one of our Reddit commenters, $. One of the answers that $$ gave us to the, basically we phrased, I can't remember exactly how we phrased the prompt, but it was basically like what BA just said there. And he said they should leave their religion at home. That was the extent of $$'s comment, just regarding politicians, they should leave their religion at home. And so I thought, hey, that's a good way of, I think, kind of titling the episode here. Should our government leaders leave their religion at home? BA, I'm going to start with you on this one. I mean, I'm not necessarily, if you want to share your opinions, you can. I'm not stopping you from that, but I'm also curious about what types of things, since you were part of this conversation that got this topic going, and what started you thinking about this, and what kind of things have you heard from the world as far as what you think people feel about this question?
So it's kind of hard to separate what I, before reading some of these comments, think, and what I, after reading some of these comments, think.
Okay.
Because we're going to touch on the same things. So red letter challenge. Really huge thing to mention when somebody talks about the separation of church and state, they're usually talking about abortion. So, and this is a conversation you and I have had before, where I personally believe that the law should allow you to do anything that is not restricted within itself. Like if there is a right to perfect freedom, then no freedom should be impinged. Any freedom that you choose to take should be taken by your action. Any freedom that you choose not to enjoy should be taken by your action. So if you're free to cross the street wherever you want, if you want to cross in the middle, at the ends, if you want to build a bridge and go over it, that's up to you. But if you choose to do any of those things, if you choose to not cross in the middle, that's your choice. Nobody else can take that choice from you in a place where everything is allowed. I view law kind of like that, and religion like taking away those choices. I think that if something is permissible and your religion says you shouldn't do it, you have every right to not do it, but you don't have the reverse. Or your religion should not allow you to break the law. Basically, your religion should stop you from enjoying a freedom within the law if you choose to engage it.
Okay. Frankly, very libertarian type of views as far as the role of government and a lot of people I know feel that way as far as the role of government. We often talk about, those on the left politically, those on the right politically, whether it be the Democratic Party, Republican Party. And I think that some people maybe don't understand there's this Libertarian Party too, that as far as the role of government, their views would be even less restrictive than like the Republican views, where, generally speaking, you look at those on the left, the Democratic Party tend to favor more government control, more government regulation, and therefore a larger government role than the Republican Party does, which is one for less government. And then, of course, you have the Libertarian Party, which would be even less government, and than even the Republican Party, and less government restrictions, I think. Is this a political show? No, this isn't a political show, but at the same time, we're tackling this topic because to think that there's not an intersection between faith and politics is, I'll go out and say it, it's naive. Yeah. Because if our faith influences the way we live our lives, well, politics is something we do in our lives, there's going to be some interaction there. And so I think we as Christians, while I'm not going to take a political stance, although I will certainly, to some extent, some people may interpret some of what I have to say with a political bent. That's not the intention. We're talking about this from a spiritual bent. I have said many times on our previous show, Trinity Talk Live, that I co-hosted with Ben Lander, that I am an independent politically. So I'm going to get that out there right off the bat. So in case anybody wants to say, oh, he's a Democrat, oh, he's a Republican, oh, he's a Libertarian. No, I am none of the above, okay? That does not mean I don't have my views. I do, and I will be upfront. They do lean right. Maybe not as far as some people would like them to, but I do lean to the right, to the conservative, I should say. But I'm not affiliated with any political party, and I do not have any loyalty to any political party. And I'll be free to criticize any person or politician or political stance. I don't like criticizing people. Typically speaking, I like criticizing positions. And I mean, people are all made in God's image. Whether I agree with them or whether I disagree with them, they deserve respect. So I try to express my opinions against positions and views and not individuals. Do I always succeed in that? No, I do fail, and sometimes, and I will apologize for that. And one thing, BA, that I'm going to ask you to think about, kind of as a general response to what you said, and then we'll get into some specifics as we get through this topic, is I do think, and here's where I'm going to expose my independence. People think, well, okay, he says he's independent, but he's really clearly Republican. I'm about to criticize those on the right, okay?
Uh-oh.
And
Viewership -5.
Yeah, so here we go. A lot of people and a lot of the views that are expressed on more on the right side of the political aisle, I think almost run the risk of equating their Christian faith with their right-leaning political views. And I'm going to speak of one specifically, and it's one that you mentioned, and it's freedom, okay? It's freedom. Now, we do talk about freedom from a Christian perspective as far as we are now free from sin. Now, people look at Christianity, outsiders look at Christianity and say, oh, it's a bunch of rules that you have to follow. You can't look at pornography. You can't do this. So you're restricting yourself, whereas me, Mr. Non-Christian, I'm actually the free one. To that I say, really? Stop watching pornography. Stop doing X, Y, or Z. See how easy that is for you to accomplish. And then tell me who's the free one and who's the slave, who's the servant, Sin has a way of wrapping itself around us so we can't escape. So we do have a concept of freedom within the Christian faith, and it's freedom from sin because sin is so powerful on us. It has that attachment to us. However, we also, especially here in America, in the West and particularly America, have this concept of freedom, and we try to equate that with a Christian right. And yet Christianity calls us to be servants. It even does. Now, I don't like using the English word slave because that has a connotation in the English language today, at this point in history, that was different from how it was used originally in the Bible. But the Bible and the way it describes God is much more in the sense of, people who serve a king, for example, than people who vote for a president. Yeah. And we sometimes forget that our relationship to God is one of servitude, not one of freedom. All right? Does God give us free will? Yes, it's a whole other conversation. But that doesn't mean that he approves of everything we do with it. It doesn't mean he's given us license to do whatever we want with our free will, and that in itself is God's will. God's will is for us to have free will, but he also wants us to use it in certain ways. Yeah. We are supposed to be servants to him. So, forgive me, I've had a bit of a cold for the past week, and for those of you that have seen me preach and stuff before, I have an ongoing problem with my vocal cords. It had been managed very well through medication, but this cold seems to have brought it back for the past week. So if I sound a little grumbly, that's why. I'm fine. It's not COVID. I've been tested. But I just sound a little weird, but I feel fine. So that's the first thing I'm going to say in that regard is let's not confuse our political views with what our faith calls us to. Christianity and what God calls us to do does not perfectly align with any political party. It doesn't. All right? And so we need to be aware of that our first loyalty has to be to Christ, not to political party. So let me go a little bit then into the question here of, politicians. And you used the phrase, BA, when you started out, separation of church and state. Yeah. Where do you think that phrase comes from?
I think it comes from an understanding of, there's like 40 thoughts combating And some of them are redcoats, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot and so I can come out and say wrong.
Well, too late.
But I am trying to illustrate that a lot of people. That's one of those phrases we hear in our culture.
Yeah.
And people have assumptions about it.
Yeah.
You know that some are true and some are not. Where do you think it comes from?
So I think that the separation of church and state is an idea that was carried over from American independence when seeking, religious and governmental freedom, both of them put together from. I'm thinking of the play Hamilton, King George, because he was a Protestant head of church. Am I right?
The Church of England.
He was from the Church of England.
Yeah.
And he would use a religious bent, not going to comment on how he ruled, to punish his citizens. And proto-Americans, I guess we can call them now, were like, hey, that's very much not right. In fact, when we run the show, they're not going to be allowed to do that. Separation of church and state. Law is law, religion's religion. We're going to keep them separate. Separation of church and state. That's where I think it comes from.
Okay. And by the way, King George, one of the funniest characters in Hamilton, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Best song.
So did you see the story about, and I'm not condoning this, actually, I'm going to criticize this because I'm also a theater director. There was a church, I want to say in Texas. Don't quote me on that. I apologize to all churches in Texas if I'm wrong about this. But they put on a production of Hamilton. And of course, they edited out all the bad language and they actually put a gospel-centric message into it. So they added stuff into it.
Okay.
And they didn't have the rights or royalties to do it.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And, and I'm sorry, I understand you don't approve of everything in Hamilton. I don't approve of everything in the play Hamilton. Then don't put on Hamilton at a church. But that's still someone else's intellectual property that you don't have the right to change. And you certainly don't have the right to use without their permission, just like, a church when a pastor writes a sermon and puts it out there, so a lot of pastors, they write book. How would you feel if somebody else just completely plagiarized your book or took your book, changed a couple words in it, then passed it off as their own? That's kind of intellectually the same thing that's going on. Anyway,
it's got to be
complete side note. It has nothing to do with our topic.
No, that's fine. Additional side note.
Yeah.
It's got to be a complete parody or no parody at all.
Yes. Yeah. And this was not a parody. They were claiming they were putting on Hamilton, but they changed it to a certain extent. And they didn't have permission. They didn't pay for the royalties. And don't do that. That's my advice. As a lawyer, don't do that. Anyway, so a lot of people, I mean, and I can agree with a lot of what you said about the origin, the notion of the separation of church and state. But a lot of people look at it and they say, well, that's in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. Well, no, it's actually not. I do want to read the specific language of what the religious portion, what we call the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment say. And what it says is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the government, and it originally was Congress when it was first passed in 1791, and it only applied to the federal government, to Congress. But then by 1833, all the states had kind of passed their own constitutions and amendments that said basically the same thing. And the Supreme Court has actually kind of, through the 14th Amendment, has now applied the Establishment and Free Exercise Clause to the states. So whatever that portion of the First Amendment means, it now applies not just to the federal government, but also to the state governments here in the United States. The question is, what does it mean? Does it mean there has to be a strict separation of church and state? And even if we say yes to that, we have to ask the question, what does separation mean? How extensive is that separation?
Yeah. And then where is it? Because religion is not numerical.
Yeah.
You can't go for religion in and then stop. Yeah.
Put a pin in that, because that's actually one of the things we're going to talk about. People seem to have this idea that you can just draw a sharp dividing line to here's where my religion ends and here's where the rest of me begins. And it just doesn't work that way. But no, the actual phrase separation or wall of separation originally was used by Roger Williams in 1635. So before the United States was even born as a sovereign nation, Roger Williams he founded Rhode Island, and he used that metaphor. And then also, in 1802, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association where he used that concept. When those were used, it was always in the context of well, like you said, the what we'd come from was a English government that had an official state religion and was requiring its citizens to belong to that particular church. And so it was always that the original mentality of this was, we don't want the government doing that. And so we put in this establishment clause. And even when that phrase was originally being used of separation of church and state, it was to make sure that the government isn't bossing churches around and telling them what they have to do. That was the context of it. All right. But it wasn't, excuse me, voice is still there. That's why I got my water on here with me today. It wasn't this idea where there has to be a complete and total separation of all things church and faith related, so that if you're going to serve in the government, for example, you cannot at all in any way, shape, or form let your faith influence your decision making. That is, a lot of people will say that that's what the separation of church and state is. The Constitution says that, the senator from Rhode Island is not allowed to allow his faith to influence how he votes in the Senate. That is false. Sometimes there's nothing else I can say to people other than, that's just wrong. That's not what it says, and pull out all the Supreme Court cases and everything to show it. Absolutely, politicians are allowed to let their faith in some way, shape, or form impact their policies and what they're voting for and what they favor and what they don't favor. And I came across this really cool article from about 7 years ago. It's actually out of Australia, but it's by a former Australia politician and legislator by the name of Christina Keneally. And she was kind of joking in this article about how people in the press used to always ask her, because she was an outspoken Catholic, and so people in the press would always ask her, well, how much does your religious faith influence how you vote in whatever, I don't know what they call their legislature there in Australia. And she actually said that occasionally, yes, religion and politics do in fact intersect. And I want to read this quote she said to explain why. She says, of course, sometimes it's going to influence my decision. She says, just as it is nonsensical to quantify the extent to which religious belief informs a political career, it is silly to claim that it never does. A person who engages in political activity is obviously shaped by their experiences, values, and beliefs. That certainly includes my religion. But, and this is getting to your point, B.A., but can I parse my worldview and tell you how much derives from my faith, my female gender, my experience as an immigrant, my role as a mother, the professors who taught me at university, or my time as a factory worker? Of course not. Yes, I believe in Jesus Christ, but I am also a disciple of Joseph Stiglitz, an economist, for those that don't know. Okay. Why did no journalist ever ask how much my economic thinking influenced my political decisions? Yeah. And so I thought that was just a brilliant way of phrasing it, that, we, for some reason, we like to think that we humans can just compartmentalize, our religion from everything else. It doesn't work that way. We can't, like she's saying, it's like we are a blend and overlapping of influences and experiences that make up who we are. All right. So you can't, it's silly to think that you could tell someone who holds to certain religious beliefs, whether they be Christian beliefs, Muslim beliefs, Hindu beliefs, I don't care, that they could somehow parse those out and, as our commenter here in Reddit said, leave those at home and just govern without any consideration whatsoever of your religious faith, Yeah. But I do think it raises an interesting question, and that is, where do you draw that line? When does it become improper? Because we do have this establishment clause, for example, and we know at least that line is drawn at the point where the government can't establish a state religion. They can't say you have to belong to this particular church. We know at least that much is clear. But when we're talking about our public servants, where do we draw the line from them in order to decide when how much of their faith is allowed to influence what they do? And what I like to say is, if you are using, let me see, hold on, I'm looking at the wrong thing here. Let me see here. If you are using your position of power to try to pass laws saying, for example, everyone needs to be baptized, or everyone needs to go to worship on Sunday at a Christian church. All right, that's clearly improper.
Yeah.
All right. But if you are, as a politician, allowing your general moral beliefs, for example, much of which is going to be derived from your religious upbringing, your religious faith, to influence what you think is right and wrong, and therefore what kind of laws our government should have, then that's perfectly okay. And for those of you that try to say that law and morality are two completely different things, I will beg to differ in this respect. Certainly, there are some laws that don't seem to have as much of a moral dimension to them. Whether you're deciding, I don't know how much withholding of taxes to require from paychecks and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I argue there's still somewhat of a moral dimension there, but lesser. But so many of our laws are clearly derived from a moral standpoint. We pass laws saying stealing is wrong, murder is wrong, and punishing these things. Why? Because we believe that those are morally wrong things to do. If those were morally perfectly fine things to do, then it would make no sense to have laws outlawing them. All right. So there is a moral dimension to law, and people arrive at their moral beliefs in different ways. Everybody has a worldview. Okay. Everybody, whether you are Christian, whether you are Muslim, whether you are an atheist. All right. You have a worldview, a way of looking at the world. You have a set of moral beliefs, and you should at least have an idea of what grounds those beliefs, what justifies your moral beliefs, okay, why they are justified. Sometimes that comes from God. Sometimes people may try to get that from elsewhere, like Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll talk about him in a little bit. He's an atheist philosopher. But everybody has a worldview. And so to say that religious politicians, religious government officials can't use their worldview, but non-religious people, well, they can use their worldview, that's not what the separation of church and state is all about. And really, that's just a sly ploy of the people who don't have a religious worldview to try to exclude all these other ideas from the marketplace so they don't get a vote, to allow the only legitimate votes are the ones that happen to agree with them. But I want to use an example to illustrate this difference, okay? A couple of examples to illustrate what I mean by, just because we have a faith, all right, and we should still be allowed to use our moral compass that comes from our faith, and our politicians should be able to use that in voting. Because the mere fact, and I've seen a lot of people do this, when they argue that political officials shouldn't be allowed to use their religion, and we'll get to abortion in a second because this is one of the prime candidates where this is done. What it seems like the argument only boils down to, well, your religious faith says X, therefore you must be voting for X on the basis of your religious faith, and you shouldn't be able to do that. Well, that makes no sense, and I'll illustrate it this way. My Christian faith says murder is wrong. Okay. Therefore, if I'm a politician, guess what? I'm going to be all in favor of laws against murder, outlawing murder.
Yeah.
Now, should I be, as a politician, prohibited from voting against a law that criminalizes murder simply because my faith happens to say murder is wrong?
I don't think so. I don't think you should be barred from it, because I also, and here, Christian guy trying to say something like outside of the realm of Christianity, I think that murder is also wrong, but I'm also Christian. So like I can't really argue with you or against you because I'm in the same boat.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you see, I think most of us, I think, would see how nonsensical it is right off the bat to say that just because my faith says murder is wrong, now all of a sudden I, as a politician who has that faith, have to vote in favor of murder? Or abstain from any votes about criminalizing murder? So the mere fact that my faith says it, or even that my worldview comes from my faith, that says that that's why that's wrong, that I believe that murder is wrong because all people are created in God's image, and therefore it's an affront to God to kill someone unjustifiably like that. The mere fact that that's the basis for my belief that murder is wrong shouldn't prevent me from voting against murder, the same type of argument is often used in the abortion debate. All right, where it seems that the extent of the argument, I'm not saying all arguments, all pro-choice arguments are like this. Please don't think I'm saying that. This is not an abortion show, so I'm not deliberately not trying to respond to every single pro-choice argument right now. All I'm saying is that one form, and a very common form of argument that comes up when people try to equate the pro-life position with you're just saying it's just your faith, what they'll say is that any politician that votes or advocates for pro-life laws should not be able to do that, because that by doing so, they are basically they're violating the separation of church and state, that they are letting their religion, they're voting based solely on their religion. Sometimes this is just factually laughably inaccurate, like the recent Dobbs decision. I've seen many people say that the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade was completely religious, and it was just something that was done by all these right-wing Christian justices in the Supreme Court. Read the Dobbs decision. That's my challenge to anybody who says that. Read it. Find me even one instance anywhere where anything that is in that entire decision is in any way, shape, or form justified by Christian faith. Or do you see the justices actually use other rational reasons? You may agree with them, you may disagree with them, okay? But they give legal reasons to justify the decision. Not once does religion ever enter the evaluation. So, I mean, some things are just factually inaccurate, and people just like to launch the accusations. But my point here is this. Remember what the example I just gave. If the Bible teaches that murdering is wrong, and I believe that because the Bible teaches it, we can all see how that's ridiculous to say that I, as a politician, shouldn't be allowed to vote in favor of laws that outlaw murder. Yeah. Well, if the Bible teaches that abortion is wrong, and I do believe it does, and that's a whole other debate we can get into, well, the mere fact that how does this play out? Well, because the argument is that the Bible teaches that the unborn are people. And again, I'm not going to get into that debate. I think it does. That's a topic for another show. But the Bible does teach that the unborn are persons that are made in the image of God, just like anybody else. All right. So if the Bible teaches that, and that's where I come at that, how I arrive at that belief in the personhood of the unborn, then it's only logical that I would then think the unjustified intentional killing of the unborn is murder and wrong. Yeah. And therefore we should have laws against it. If you can see how ridiculous the first example is, all right, but you still find yourself trying to somehow work around the second one, then really what you're doing is just content-based discrimination, where you're basically saying, well, you're not employing a general principle that would be applied in all scenarios. You're trying to kind of shift the bar and change the rule based upon whether we're talking about murder of an adult or whether we're talking about abortion. The underlying principle is still the same. It doesn't matter how I've arrived at this worldview, this particular moral belief. I, as a politician, should still be allowed to vote for that particular belief. All right. So some people may agree, may disagree, but I think I'm at least being consistent. That's the point, is to have consistency. So I do think that, again, if we are trying to enforce a law, if a politician is trying to enforce a law requiring people to be adherents of a particular religion, requiring everybody to be baptized, requiring, if it's a Muslim, requiring everyone to pray towards Mecca, to pray 3 times a day, facing Mecca, all right? That clearly is a politician trying to allow their faith to violate the Establishment Clause, to force their faith upon other people. But allowing a politician to vote their conscience, all right, even if that conscience is derived from a religious worldview versus a secular worldview, that is something that politicians absolutely should be required to do. So, let's see, what other notes did I have on here that I wanted to go into? There was something else. All right. Here's the other thing I wanted to point out is that what happens is a lot of people who advocate for this, who will say that religious people should just keep their views at home, whether it be, well, sometimes they say people at large, but here we're talking about government officials. They should just keep their views at home. They're kind of ignoring the fact that even atheists, for example, atheists, agnostics, whatever, they still have a worldview. All right. They still have their own moral opinions. And essentially what they're doing is they're trying to elevate somehow their moral beliefs, their moral code above those held by religious people. Keep in mind, we've already established that the Establishment Clause does not prohibit politicians from allowing their personal moral convictions, whether they be religious or otherwise, to vote their conscience. It doesn't. All right. So then when people still say, okay, well, maybe the Establishment Clause doesn't do that, but I think it's morally wrong for someone, and they usually phrase it like this, to force their religion on someone else. And they say anytime a politician is voting based upon their religious worldview, they're forcing their religion on someone else. Well, I can flip that around and say, well, guess what? You as an atheist still have a worldview you've arrived at somehow. So how is it any more morally appropriate for you to be forcing your atheistic worldview upon everybody else? It's special pleading. It's basically saying that it's or circular reasoning. It's assuming that their worldview is somehow superior and more entitled to a place in the marketplace than religious worldviews are. And I did have an example that I wanted to give about this, if I could. Let's pretend, for example, that someone is inspired by the teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche, all right? Okay. Atheistic philosopher, all right? They love Friedrich Nietzsche, such that they have they've allowed their moral compass, their moral worldview, to be built around the teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche, okay. All right? Now, someone else comes along, and this other person says, Friedrich Nietzsche never existed. I don't believe in Friedrich Nietzsche, all right?
Okay.
All right. Is that second person's moral code somehow more worthy of a place in the marketplace than the first one?
I'm going to say no.
Okay, good, because that's the easy one.
Yeah.
All right. The mere fact that I don't believe that the person who is the source of how you arrived at your moral code doesn't exist doesn't somehow by default make my moral code better and more worthy of being heard than yours. Matter of fact, in that example, I'd question the sanity of someone who doubts the existence of Friedrich Nietzsche. Okay, but regardless.
I've had that feeling before. I wonder why. Okay. Sorry, please go on.
Now, let's just swap out same logical form. This is what philosophers love to do. You now take this exact same logical form of what we just talked about, and you just swap out the subjects. All right. If we say that I got one person who says, I'm a big fan of God and have arrived at my moral code based upon the teachings of God, but then someone else says God doesn't exist, does the mere fact that this other person says God does not exist and thinks God does not exist somehow make their moral code more worthy of being heard and listened to than the one who arrived at the moral code because based on God? No, it doesn't. All right. And so the foundation of this idea that merely because something is religious in origin, it's not worthy of as big of a voice is ridiculous. And we can see that if you just swap out the terms. The only way you get around that, and this is the underlying assumption that a lot of atheists make, and they don't want to acknowledge they're making it, but they are, okay, is it's circular reasoning. The only reason you would say that the atheist worldview and the atheist moral code is more worthy of consideration than the religious moral code is if you start out by assuming that religious belief is per se false or per se ridiculous. All right. Kind of like the person who doesn't believe in Friedrich Nietzsche, but still, but you see what that's doing. That's circular reasoning. That's assuming the conclusion that they want to arrive at. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, I don't think that religious belief is per se ridiculous. But this gets to another quote, actually building on that. If anything, I have more, and I think we have more reason to question the legitimacy of a moral code that's arrived at someone who doesn't believe in a higher power than that from someone who does. And this was because, keep in mind, we talked about this before on the show, if you don't believe in any kind of transcendent authority, you don't believe in God or, whether it be the Islamic God or the Jewish God or the Christian God, then you have a hard time explaining where moral beliefs, moral laws, moral rules come from in the first place. Yeah. And so you really are just left to the the winds of opinion in deciding what's right and what's wrong. And that kind of makes you a little less trustworthy. And you also have to inevitably believe in a world that has no purpose, has no meaning, because there's nothing transcendent above us to give it purpose or meaning. The best you can hope for is individual purposes and meanings that we just pick throughout our lives arbitrarily, you know?
Maybe we'll get lucky.
Yeah, maybe we'll get lucky, yeah. But this is another quote from that Australian politician, Christina Keneally, that I wanted to bring up. And she said this, she says, "I have often wondered about atheist politicians. Which politician is scarier? The one who insists there is ontological meaning and transcendental purpose to our lives, or the one who denies objective truth and believes existence is an untimely, useless void?" You know, so the irony here is that, if anything, I would argue that some actually removing people with religious worldviews from our government institutions and saying you're not allowed to have those religious worldviews influence you in any way, shape, or form, that's scary, because what Ms. Keneally is pointing at is what you're left with. What you're left with is a bunch of politicians who have no basis for objective meaning, who have no basis for objective truth. And is that really the kind of people we want making our decisions? Now, I'm not naive to the fact that there are certainly religious people, religious ideas that are better than others. And there are certainly religious ideas that we don't want governing our governments, that we don't want, influencing our governments. That's what voting is for, and that's kind of the purpose to it. And that is what the general laws are for. So we do have laws outlining certain things, outlawing certain things and certain other things. That's kind of the point. But that does not justify the fact that you have a certain subset of religious views that you would not want influence your government, does not justify banning all religious views, any more than the fact that there is a subset of secular views that we would not want governing our government to justify banning all secular worldviews from having a voice. All right? It works both ways.
Yeah.
So
we do have your first comment.
I can't hear you. Is your mic on?
It is now. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
He can hear me. You could always hear me. We have our first comment from YouTube.
Okay.
From Robert Koger. Hey, I know him.
All right. I've met that guy once or twice before.
Okay. He says, "There's a reason we say one nation under God in our pledge, and in God we trust on our money."
Yeah, and I will tell you that the Supreme Court has actually upheld those types of things. Now, they have upheld them based upon the justification that is not the government establishing a religion. It is more acknowledging the heritage of our country. All right. I mean, you look at the Declaration of Independence. What does it say? That all people are
created
equal, that they are given by their creator certain inalienable rights by their creator, created equal. And so there is certainly we can dispute whether it's a Christian origin or not. Like I told you, the whole idea of freedom at the beginning of the show actually is not entirely Christian, but it is certainly religious in nature. And so what the Supreme Court has said is that those particular instances are acknowledgments of that is the foundation of our country. That does not mean that they're requiring everybody to believe that. That's the beautiful thing about our country, is you're not required to believe that. Yeah. And that is a Christian value, which I'll get to in a second here before we close out. I wanted to mention that, Christianity is not a religion of coercion. We do not believe in forcing as much. Yes, in history, it has been used that way sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's been wrong. Okay.
Yep.
Did you have something else you wanted to say about Robert's comment? You looked like you had a thought on the tip of your tongue and I interrupted you.
If I did, I forgot the sensation. So
okay.
You can carry on.
Yeah, so the one thing I wanted to point out here at the end was kind of what I was touching on there, and that is that the fact that I am saying, Robert said something else now.
Yes, he did.
What did he say now?
He says, people originally came to the New World because they wanted to believe in their own way, and other churches kind of just told them to go away.
Well, especially if you look at the Puritans up in New England, for example, that was very much their motivation, they established their own colonies, to try to be able to practice religious freedom they didn't have elsewhere, especially in England, where they were, under the thumb of the Church of England, required to be part of the Church of England. Absolutely correct. The fact that I'm saying that politicians and our government leaders absolutely should be allowed to use their religious convictions and moral code and worldview to influence their decisions, sometimes that gets taken too far.
Yeah.
Does that mean that we should be in favor of I don't want to use the word Christian nation because that can mean a number of different things. Are you talking about our history, our roots, whatever? But a Christian nation in the sense that a country where Christianity is the official state religion and that we actually do legislate, that we have this official state religion of the Christian religion. No, all right? No, we should not. And we as Christians should not be advocating for that for a couple of reasons. Number one, does the Bible say that Jesus is going to return and rule all? Yes.
Yeah.
That's our privilege. That's reserved for Jesus, not you. Okay? I mean, that's the first point that I want to make. Because there's a fundamental difference between Jesus and you, or between Jesus and me, or between Jesus and BA, or even Robert, who's commenting online.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay? The fundamental difference is Jesus is God. Jesus is perfect. We ain't, all right? We are fallen creatures, all right? And so any government run by human beings is going to be imperfect, all right? And so even a government, and we've seen this before, Constantine established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, and we see where that led throughout history. I mentioned the fact there have been times in history where Christianity has been spread by the sword. Why do you think that is? Because once we blended political power with the church and gave the church political power, the church is still run by fallible human beings, all right, who are going to use that power in sinful ways. Jesus ain't going to do that, all right? We are. And so we as Christians should be able to acknowledge that what God has done, yes, in the book of Romans, God did, Romans 13:1, God did say, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So he does say that God establishes ruling authorities. But Jesus also said in Mark 12:17, give back to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. Render unto Caesar what that belongs to Caesar. Render unto God that belongs to God. And the point here is, yes, Jesus wants us to have governing authorities, but there are certain roles that the government is supposed to fulfill and certain roles that the church is supposed to fulfill, all right? The church is not supposed to be the government is not supposed to be the church. We've seen where this isn't a hard dividing line, like some who say separation of church and state try to think. There's overlap, obviously. You can't completely remove faith from the decisions of your government leaders. But at the same time, we shouldn't be pushing for a Christian state because any Christian state that's established right now is going to be led by fallible human beings. And here's where I started out criticizing some of the views that tend to be held by political folks on the right. Here's where you'll see that my right-leaning views come through, is that I think from a Christian perspective, mind you, the best form of government is a limited one. For that very reason, because any form of government is going to be led by fallible human beings. We're going to mess up. We're going to abuse our power. And so the more we can limit the power that the government has to just those things that it really needs to have, the better. The less opportunity we're giving government to become oppressive, the less power we're putting into the hands of sinful humans to control. On top of that, firm believer in checks and balances. You don't want to put too much power in one branch, because when you do that, that's, again, a branch that's being led by fallible human beings.
Yep.
And so you want to have checks from other branches. So effective checks and balances, limited government, I think is consistent with what the Bible teaches us about human nature. So does that mean, BA, that since I've come to that belief about the proper role of government from my religious faith, that I can not be a politician?
Unfortunately, Ken, you cannot be a politician. You've said so yourself. I heard you before you said on the show, I can't be a politician because I'm Christian. That's totally what you said. Oh, I've uncrossed my fingers. No, that wasn't what you meant at all. You can run for government. Vote for Ken, everyone.
No, I'm not actually running. I will never run for political office. I will never do it. I don't like politics. Okay. I said I wasn't going to start by attacking people. I won't name particular. As a general rule, I don't have a terribly high opinion of politicians. Why? For exactly the reason I just said. I could give you example after example after example where I think politicians are, let's just say, showing their fallen humanity. Yeah. You know, we'll just leave it at that, maybe.
That's a good place to leave it. Yeah.
All right. I know we're running long on the show today, and I just picked up all my notes, and so I blended them all together. Mm-hmm. But I did have somewhere here, I mentioned the one comment that was made by D$. There were a couple other ones in here. Was there any of the comments from Reddit that stood out to you that you wanted to address, however briefly here, BA?
There were some comments. I want to address another one from Robert Koger on YouTube. You can't be a politician. You're too honest. Ha ha. There you go.
I appreciate that coming from Robert. You know why I appreciate that coming from Robert? Because I was even just saying to my daughter earlier today that, Robert, I joke way too much at your expense. I do. I love Robert. Robert and I have that kind of relationship. I hope so. He picks on me too. But, you know, that the fact that you still think I'm honest, even with some of the things I've said about you, all in jest, all in love, and I hope you get that, you know.
It's all good stuff.
Means a lot, man.
I do want to take the highlighted one that's said right here by Schrode, presumably a shortened version of Schrodinger. We do not need a morality police, bracket, ellipses, or adherence to zealotry, and the paraphrasing of what they said because we don't have a lot of time.
Right.
I agree that we don't need a morality police brought to you by the law. I believe that we should follow a moral rule set. The one that I've chosen is Christianity. So there's where I sit on that. And like we said before, you can't split a person in half and take their non-religious half to work and leave the other one at home. So someone's going to bring their moral policing with them to the office, whether that's a ballot box or the Oval Office.
Well, and even I would point out to Schrode that I like to ask questions.
I guess Schrode.
Schrode? I'm sorry, you're
probably
right.
Schrode.
Probably Schrode. Thank you. And you said that before. We don't need a morality police. And yet, Schrode, is that your moral opinion? And it's your moral opinion that you think should be governing the way our government works. You know, I mean, you can't escape it.
Yeah.
That in itself, what you suggested there is a moral opinion. All right, and you're saying that moral rule, that moral principle that you laid down, is what should be guiding the way our government runs.
Yeah.
You know, we can't escape it. Morality does overlap with our laws, with our government, whether we recognize it or not. There is crossover. And so people use that, phrase like that, morality police, because we don't want people coming out and saying, well, you must follow my moral code. But to some extent, and obviously there's a line, I think, where we need to appropriately draw between things that should be illegal and things that, well, maybe still should be immoral, but we should still be free to do under the name of our freedom. Revisit the first discussion at the beginning of the episode again. Yeah. Won't go into that again. But inevitably, our police do govern morality because morality underlies the justification for criminality and what we call criminal and what we don't call criminal.
Yeah. If there was no morality, there would not be law.
Yeah.
Because you have a reason to make a law in the first place. Hey, I don't like that. We're going to ban it. Okay. Well, why did you ban it? Because you didn't like it.
Yeah. I mean, even your what people would think would be morally innocuous laws, like, your tax laws. Well, you still have a moral justification for requiring taxation in the first place because you need the government to run. Why do you need the government to run? Well, because the government provides, food resources for people who are in need. We just said something moral. Yeah. You still get there. It might not be as direct of a path and as clear and obvious of a path, but even these laws that you might think have no moral dimension to them have a moral dimension to them, in some way, shape, or form. Any other comments on there?
I think through all the things that we've done, we've pretty much talked about all of them, just without mentioning their names. We've talked about, for better, for worse, government leaders will be affected by their personal faith. They should leave their religion at home, like we started with. Their personal religion will affect their decision. That's inevitable. We've talked about that. Yep. Thank you, Valere. Thank you, $sign with the Dudley. Thank you. Hold on, what's this one? Oh, that's a long boy. Chikorita Leaf. Thank you, Chikorita Leaf.
The only other one I'm going to mention here very briefly, it's going back to the abortion. I know this isn't an abortion episode, but it was related to this. That was brought up by, is it Jogo So 2014? It's on the first page. And I'm just going to read the first part of it because we don't have time for everything. So then thinking abortion is murder has no bearing on abortions being legal. It just means they would never get or endorse an abortion. And it's the old argument that, if you don't like abortion, don't have one. Okay, but following that logic, so thinking the unjustified killing of an innocent person is murder has no bearing on murder being legal. And it just means that you personally should never go out and unjustifiedly kill an innocent person. I mean, do you see the illogic of that argument that just people like to say, well, you don't like abortion, don't have one. Okay, well, you don't like murder, don't kill anybody. You're like, no, it kind of avoids the subject. It's still a legitimate topic of conversation about whether or not it should be legally outlawed. Just like you wouldn't tell someone, well, you don't like murder, don't murder anybody. You would still see that, yes, somebody, even if they don't like murder, okay, then they have the legal or the moral authority or permission to allow that view to be expressed in their opinion about whether or not murder should be illegal. If someone doesn't like abortion and they think abortion is immoral, then yes, they're allowed to have that viewpoint, that worldview influence their decision about whether abortion should be legal or not. It's one of those things where you just swap out the terms and it kind of illustrates why that argument kind of falls apart. Yeah. So, all right, that's all I'm going to say. Are we good?
We're good.
All right, then let's sign off quickly because this show has gone on very long, and I've got to go teach a class here in a couple of hours.
Oh, boy.
So, hey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining today. Robert, thank you for your comments today.
Yeah, thanks,
and a reminder, there is no episode next week. We will be honoring Randy Gass, which gives you 2 weeks to go to that website I told you about, which is trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff, and submit your question, your comment, your topic. What questions, concerns, topics do you have about Christianity, Christians, the Bible, anything like that you would like us to talk about on this show? Go to that website, fill out that form, submit them, and we will look at those and use those to select a topic for future shows. And again, if you're not on Reddit, you want to get on Reddit, visit the subreddit, Talk About God. We post things on there as well that you can also use to get your thoughts to us. Give us a like. The thumbs up on this video makes it more likely that YouTube's going to show it to other people. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Click that notification bell so you don't miss out on anything, including the 513 show, which I pitched at the top of this program. That is coming on. Robert says, see you at the well. We'll see you at the well, Robert. And you will see Robert Koger on the 513 show. This same celebrity man who is commenting on this episode is the host of the 513 show, which premieres next Thursday, 1 week from tomorrow at 7:00 p.m. on this channel. Don't miss it. See you on this show in 2 weeks or any of our other vast programming all the time. All right. Thank you, BA.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. God bless.